Stop. Imagine you are looking into a mirror. What do you see? Where are you? Sometimes the reflection we see is not what we expected. Our choices, small and large, change our trajectories. No one can be sure. But we can be sure that those in power likely made some sacrifices. For some, they are small. For others, they are crimes.
On this episode of the Infosec Sidekick podcast, we'll review the Joe Sullivan Trial information and dissect the lessons we can learn and how things might change for CISOs everywhere. Together with my special guest, Matt Stamper, we'll talk about it all. Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of the Infosec Sidekick podcast. My name is Travis Romero, your host, and today we're going to be talking about ex-Uber CSO Joe Sullivan and the recent sentencing that came out on May 5th, 2023. The big news is that he did not go to jail and instead was forced to serve 3 years of probation and pay a $50,000 fine. Now, before we begin, I wanted to ask if you'd like to support the podcast, please consider going to www.infoseksidekick.com and subscribing for free, or subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening. My guest today is Matt Stamper, an industry veteran CISO. But before we get into that conversation where we'll basically dive into all the details of this case and discuss the prospects for CISOs in the future based on this sentencing, I wanted to kind of go through the background of this case just to give everyone a refresher. And it's possible that a lot of people out there haven't actually sat down and read the court documents because, this has been a story that has been mostly headlines. And, as updates have come around, we tune in and then kind of tune out because we're all pretty busy. So I don't want to take too much time, but I do want to go through the background of the court case so we have a firm grounding before we dive into this conversation with Matt. This court case originates from a 2016 cybersecurity incident and data breach at Uber, where approximately 600,000 driver's license numbers were exfiltrated by hackers. At the time, Joe Sullivan was the chief security officer at Uber. And also during this time, perhaps most importantly, Uber was under FTC investigation for a 2014 cyber incident. As part of the FTC investigation, Joe Sullivan was called to testify to the FTC. And the kind of crazy part about this to me is that approximately 10 days after he actually testified, they received an email from a quote-unquote unknown actor that had revealed that these hackers accessed Uber's data. At this time, Uber's incident response team worked to handle the breach, and that included communicating with the hackers to confirm the breach, that it wasn't fake, basically, and then also to kind of determine the scope of the cyber incident. The response team logged actions, along outside issues and questions, as is pretty standard within cyber incident response processes, in a document called the Preacher Central Tracker. And the reason it was called this is because they had nicknamed the hackers or the hacker group Preacher. This is, I think, fairly common as well within cyber incident response. Code names and code words will be used. They didn't want to just call an internal document the massive, Uber breach document. So yes, they nicknamed this one Preacher. And basically in that document, at least from the testimony in the trial, there was some reported verbiage there related to the FTC investigation and Joe Sullivan's recent testimony there about how this could play very badly on previous assertions. This is something that Joe was recently deposed to talk about. So this was something that I think anyone who's done incident response, if there was a bad time for a cybersecurity incident and it was recognized, this was certainly it. In the court documentation, there was a lot of claims that Sullivan stressed secrecy around this cyber incident. Now, it's not uncommon, again, for cybersecurity professionals to keep this kind of thing on the down low because it's very, it can be very damaging for an organization. But I believe, the tone in the court documents and what was being said was this was very much, we got to keep this under wraps, right? So there was one quote where he told a direct report, this can't get out. He told the first response team, we need to keep this tightly controlled. And so they began communicating directly with this, what they called the A team, which was essentially a series of executives reporting up to the CEO. From there, Joe Sullivan and an attorney at Uber worked to classify this data breach essentially under their bug bounty program. Now, there are a couple problems with this, obviously, seeing as, ultimately Joe didn't succeed in classifying this breach as a bug bounty program payout. But just to highlight some of these, the payout that they gave the hackers was, I believe, roughly $100,000. Their typical maximum bug bounty payout was around $10,000. So there was a bit of a discrepancy there from a legal standpoint. They also had them sign an NDA. The hackers signed an NDA in exchange for this payment. In this NDA, one of the things that I found quite interesting from, I guess, just like a legal consistency standpoint is that the hackers were not allowed to blog or kind of speak publicly about this breach that they had done. And anyone who's, legitimately in the cybersecurity community, I think knows that, bug bounty folks and people who find these types of vulnerabilities or issues within cybersecurity software or at organizations, there's often this kind of clout component where, you'll do a write-up after so much time passes, or, the software vendor is able to remediate a vulnerability. You can write this article about how, here's how I found it, here's what I did, and kind of bring public awareness to, the process as well as your or multiple people's names, because, especially in this case, it was quite a big deal. But anyway, the reason I find this kind of interesting is because in the FAQ on the bug bounty page for Uber, it stated that you do have the right to kind of do this blog post type clout gaining activity. And so there was a little bit of a discrepancy there as well. Another aspect of this case is that there were multiple exhibits showcased that showed that the NDA that was signed by the hackers were actually modified or edited by Joe Sullivan himself. So certain, there was testimony around language that was included, including you promised that you did not take or store any data during or through your research, and that you forensically destroyed all information. And basically they testified that this was, quote unquote, Joe's idea. Now, there are a ton of details that I glazed over. And I think there's some really interesting, minute details in the court documents that I've glazed over and don't really feel confident in talking about in detail right this moment. But I would encourage anyone who's really curious about this to go. All the documents are public record. Just to kind of go through that. And there's plenty of other publications out there who have at this point written really good summarizations of the trial and all the data that's kind of come to light as part of that. But the ultimate kind of scenario is that there was a 2016 data breach and Joe was accused of trying to cover this up. While Uber was under active FTC investigation, and ultimately he was found guilty of that for whatever that is worth. Now, the headlines in the media are, in my opinion, pretty sensationalized, as they usually are, and because they get clicks and things. But immediately on May 5th, once the sentencing came down, prosecutors were asking for, I believe, something like 15 years in prison. The sentencing came out and the judge said, no, we're not going to do the prison thing. We're going to instead give you 3 years of probation and charge you $50,000 as a fine. So now that the saga is over, what does it all mean? Is there anything to gain from reviewing this? Well, maybe I'm a little biased, but as someone who works primarily in cyber incident response, I think there's a lot we can learn. And in fact, there's a lot of moments in this incident response process at Uber that I can empathize with, right? First of all, no one likes to receive notification that, you've essentially been breached. And so all of the emotions and the intensity that comes with that moment, you really have to kind of put yourself into that moment, right? Of, maybe it's a little bit more difficult for many of us to put ourselves into Joe Sullivan's shoes in particular, but, into the shoes of all of the people that are supporting that cyber incident response process, and just the, what is likely, at least initially, a little bit of chaos, where people are trying to, adhere to incident response plans and, actively finding gaps in the procedures that you didn't account for, and this all introduces a level of uncertainty, of improbability or error proneness. That's probably not a word, but so I really do like to put myself into that state of mind, and when we look through this, right, and think, is there anything we can take away, besides the somewhat obvious, don't lie to the government or try and cover up stuff when you're under active investigation. That's, I think, easy to say, and easy to conclude here. But there's likely a lot more we can pull out. The last thing I'll mention before we get into my interview with Matt Stamper is that the judge, well, I won't quote him directly, essentially said that the next person that does this is getting jail time. So, I guess if you're a CISO out there, you may want to, internalize those words a little bit. However, I feel like this was largely known. And it's actually, it's even possible that Joe Sullivan got off easy Whereas, we didn't really need this trial to remind us or let us know that if you lie and try and cover something up, um, especially during an active investigation, that it could lead to legal consequences. So, again, take that for what it's worth. I'm going to let Matt Stamper chime in on this here. Matt is a good friend of mine, someone who played an integral role in my understanding of incident response. So let's get right into my interview with Matt Stamper. All right. Hey, everyone. I'm here with my guest, Matt Stamper, CEO of Executive Advisors Group. I've known Matt for a number of years now, and we've worked together personally. He's played a large role in my understanding of cyber incident response. But Matt is a multi-time CISO. He has extensive experience in the cybersecurity industry, working in multiple verticals, and I think he's had the honor of speaking with literally thousands of CISOs and CIOs, as well as board of directors, and kind of advising them, talking about the incident response process, among many other things. And he's worked in many different verticals as well. So this breadth of experience is something that I personally really value and think is pretty awesome. So I'm very honored to have Matt here. Thank you, Matt, for joining us on the podcast here today. Today, we're here to discuss the Joe Sullivan v. USA sentencing. This is the big news of the past week. I think it uniquely kind of caught the ears of CISOs everywhere, the cybersecurity community, whether that was warranted or not. And I think, you might have some thoughts on, what was focused on there. But why don't we just kind of kick it off, get right into the banter? What were some of your observations about the Joe Sullivan case and sentencing?
I think first and foremost, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. So I love being able to talk shop with you and have the opportunity to discuss this and a handful of other, I think, really important issues that our industry and our profession face right now. The dynamics with respect to the Sullivan case in Uber, I think, are being fundamentally conflated in the media, in our community at large. As a general rule of thumb, I don't think CISOs are going to face civil or criminal charges for the nature and extent and the quality of their security programs. There's other vehicles to kind of weigh in on those. What we had here was a case where there was a Federal Trade Commission investigation of quote unquote unfair and deceptive trade practices, akin to Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act. And there was effectively interference in that investigation, to wit, what we've seen take place with Joe Sullivan as an individual. So I think one of the things that's really critical for us in our profession is to not necessarily say, wow, CISOs are now going to be criminally charged for the quality of their security programs. That is clearly not the case. There may be dynamics in the future that I think we need to be aware of, where the quality of our programs is going to come into much greater scrutiny than it has been historically, even though it's still very much a high scrutiny environment. So I guess my recommendation would be is we should take pause. Those of us that function as CISOs, I don't think, again, that we're really going to be in the crosshairs per se, but there's a lot of interesting dynamics afoot that I think we need to be aware of as it relates to liability from the CISO role, especially professional liability and high turnover amongst individuals in our profession.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, Matt. Something really important to highlight, right? The fact that Uber was under an active investigation, and this was effectively, obstruction of that investigation. I wonder, this kind of just popped into my head, do you think this all would have happened if they weren't under investigation at the time, and this was just kind of a botched cyber incident response procedure?
I think the investigation is clearly material to the overall environment. The other thing that I think is really important is the proverbial tone at the top, how the executive leadership team, most notably the CEO and the CFO, views cyber risk, how they view incidents that occur within their operating environment. As you and I are both perfectly aware, there's never going to be perfect security. There will always be security incidents, up to and including potentially very damaging data breaches, and with operational technology, even potentially physical harm to individuals that the executive leadership team and the board need to be aware of. I don't think any of us really have the luxury of having worked in those circumstances specific to the case with Uber to really weigh in. I would say part of it is a tone at the top. Do you work in an organization that values transparency, or do you work in an organization that is effectively trying to obfuscate or hide material information from the market, from regulators, from other stakeholders? I think that's really kind of the critical, almost a binary factor with most of our security programs. How well are we communicating certain types of risk considerations, risk factors to the executive leadership team, to the board of directors, external stakeholders, consumers, regulators, whatever the case may be? I think that's really kind of foundational to how we look at our security programs.
Yeah. And in this specific case, I believe Joe Sullivan reported directly to the CEO. Is that your recollection?
That's
as well?
my understanding. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I guess maybe now the conversation is less centered around that, or there's still a conversation, where does the CISO need to be reporting to? I think more and more the conversation is like standardized around the CISO should probably have a direct line to the CEO. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you can educate me there a little bit, but in this case, he had a line. I believe in the court documents, there was even like text messages between the CEO and Joe Sullivan, kind of discussing what they were going to do here. Do you think in this, and this might be a weirdly controversial question, but do you think that in this case, having that direct line to the CEO and being empowered, like in that sense, made a difference? Or I guess I also want to frame that in the way of like, when you're performing a cyber incident response or a breach response of this magnitude, like, what if you aren't reporting directly to the CEO? I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts around that.
I think ultimately, from a personal perspective, I will always err on the side of transparency. And that transparency and disclosure needs to be communicated to the executive leadership team and by extension up to the board of directors. If you're the CEO of a company, if you're a member of the board of directors, nobody wants to be broadsided by some type of risk that should have been reasonably anticipated. That's a whole different discussion than keeping material information away from stakeholders who have an obligation to disclose that, who have an obligation to protect themselves if there's risk from a consumer perspective. One of the reasons why we see, and they're not necessarily that effective, consumer monitoring tools and things of that nature that go into play with data breaches. But fundamentally, there's a series of kind of mandated disclosures that I think are now required. We certainly see this with the proposed rules from the Securities and Exchange Commission, where the CISO should be able to communicate to the executive leadership team, primarily the CEO and the CFO, in a largely unfettered manner. In other words, they need to be able to disclose material risk as defined by the SEC. Material risk is that type of risk that a reasonable investor would use to make a decision whether he or she would sell the stock, buy more of the stock, or keep the stock, whatever the case may be. But it's material to how they have their proverbial calculus to make a decision on that equity. I really do go back to this notion of the proverbial tone at the top. You've got organizations that don't want to be informed of bad news. And those organizations, you tend to see them in the headlines. And then you've got other organizations that are proactively looking for issues because they want to be able to remediate those and address those and disclose those in an appropriate fashion. I think at the heart of it is this notion of trust, in my view. Trust engenders goodwill. Trust engenders growth. Trust is an enormously powerful attribute that we have in our economy. Companies that engender trust, I think, are generally doing better with the market. than those companies that are effectively breaking trust with their employees, breaking trust with consumers, with regulators, and even intra-company dynamics, where you're my CEO and I'm purposively withholding information from you that may be material to how you look at risk or strategy or initiatives within the company. So I think the tone at the top is really a critical factor that we need to look into.
Yeah, and it sounds to me like that's definitely something that a CISO should be kind of probing at when they're thinking about moving into a position or selecting a company, and especially if they have this kind of Joe Sullivan case in mind or any worry about the position at all, like potentially that trust factor and that, passing of that kind of smell test of, is this how the organization operates, is going to be critical to help, avoid even being put into this type of position to be able to like falter in such a way in the first place. So that's really great insight. Do you think the role of the CISO changes in a material way from this? I think, there's been, again, mostly just kind of like headlines and kind of snap reactions, which are very easy to make when, you're just looking at the kind of most recent news. But do you think the role of the CISO changes kind of going forward? Is there any takeaways? I know there's probably a lot to learn here, but does the role of the CISO materially change in your opinion?
I don't think it materially changes. I think this is a good example to highlight some of the unique attributes and dynamics of this role, because as part of this role, we are almost by definition obsessed at looking at bad things. What could happen if, what are those scenarios where my organization may experience a data breach or have a service interruption. And so constantly we're looking at the bad side of things, if you will, trying to figure out how do I take something that may be a vulnerability or a risk or a threat to the organization, contextualize it, make some recommendations in terms of ways to improve it. But effectively, we're constantly coming back and saying, oh, by the way, this isn't as good as it could be, or that isn't as good as it could be, or we need to do a little bit more of this and a lot less of that. There's a squeaky wheel element, quite bluntly, with the CISO role. But I think there are approaches to this that can fundamentally change the dynamic. So I think first and foremost, we need to look at security as a subset, or cybersecurity as a subset of broader enterprise risk. How does my security program underpin and support operational initiatives, the reputation of the company, regulatory compliance, business development and marketing activities? Can I show that my security program is facilitating those higher level objectives? And then where I find issues, can I express those issues ideally, or challenges or threats or vulnerabilities? Can I express those in business related terms? I think one thing that CISOs historically have done is a relatively poor job of translating technical risk into business risk. And that's foundational to our role. We have to be able to quickly distill and synthesize lots and lots of technical risks that the organization confronts and say, here's a couple of approaches that we can do that will change this risk pattern or these risk factors to be more aligned with the organization. So I think the fundamental role of the CISO hasn't changed because of this particular issue with Uber and Joe Sullivan. But the focus on the CISO role is clearly there. And I do think structurally there are some things that we need to be aware of. I know this may be a little bit of a challenge discussion. I do not believe that CISO should report into the CIO. I think there are too many inherent conflicts of interest there that make that reporting relationship challenged. I recognize that probably 30 to 50% of our colleagues do in fact report into CIOs or into traditional IT. I don't think that's necessarily advisable over time. I think there are many relationships where that's good, but there's also a number of relationships where the CIO, he or she has got so many other priorities. And if we're constantly coming in and kind of judging their work and also explaining or highlighting a number of problems, it creates an inherently conflicted relationship. in many cases, not all of them, but in many cases. So I think ultimately our role is that of kind of risk and resilience and helping the organization to use cybersecurity best practices to align to the business. But CISOs really do have to dramatically increase our ability to speak in language, in business language, and not necessarily technical language.
Yeah, great takes there. Do you think Joe Sullivan being the chief security officer of both physical and digital security played any role in this? When Joe Sullivan joined Uber, they were facing a lot of physical security challenges, right? There was significant kind of like driver endangerment issues, and I believe, I don't want to postulate on it too much because I'd rather people just kind of look it up themselves and know the facts. But there were these kind of significant physical safety risks involved with running Uber. And obviously, Uber at its core is a tech company. So it's like this weird combination, or not so weird these days, but this combination of physical and digital. And, anyone who's taken a CISSP exam knows there's a physical security component to cybersecurity. But I wonder what your take is on like a CSO being, in charge of both. And do you think that this may have kind of exacerbated the situation at all at Uber?
I don't think it did. And I think when we look at it respectfully, chief security officer, chief information security officer, those are ultimately going to be distinctions without much difference. We've got too much operational technology connected to traditional IP and IT networks. And the consequence is that those environments are blurring. What I do think is really critical to capture is how pervasive the CISO or CSO role is in an organization. We're expected to know applications, network, storage, compute, cloud services, third-party vendors, regulations, privacy, physical technology, operational technology, access controls, you name it. The breadth and depth that the CISO or CSO, he or she is expected to kind of oversee and manage that risk is inordinately complicated. To wit, I think in many cases now, especially for larger organizations, you're seeing something akin to the office of the CISO with business information security officers and or designated individuals within that broader team that are specialists in, let's say, physical security or specialists in operational technology security or identity governance, whatever the case may be, just simply because the body of knowledge that we're charged to really understand and manage risk for just continues to expand every single day. But in the case of Uber, it's an important, the issue is, okay, was that role stretched so thin that he was not able to address certain types of risk factors or considerations, potentially? But then the same could be said for you and me and every other CISO in our environment. I mean, we've got an inordinately complicated attack surface, an inordinately complicated threat landscape that we have to deal with. And we face adversaries that are highly trained and skilled and have little compunction to follow the law or to do what is right and appropriate. So, the other dynamic of this too is we lose sight of the fact that this whole role, if we take the resiliency side of it, would be like enterprise architecture and all that. But this whole role is fundamentally here almost like a chief of police. We're fighting crime, various forms of crime, whether it's nation state, organized crime, kind of incidental smash and grab type crime, whatever it might be. But effectively, what we're talking about is criminal behavior affecting our enterprises. And if we were to see businesses being broken into in the same kind of physical dynamic that we see with intellectual property and data being stolen and our kind of logical assets being attacked all the time, we'd be looking at this very differently. I'm an ex-Teamster, so there's a part of me that would love to sell this at layer one.
Well, I think at the very least, that's a very effective storytelling device, right? Because, one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking there is that's kind of the CISO's primary objective when they first join an organization, right? If you go into a role and you find that you're stretched too thin and you don't surface that, that's a failure on your part, right?
Yeah.
And I really like that analogy to kind of, physical crime. A phishing email could be akin to like, you owning a store and someone comes in and grabs a candy bar, right? It's not ultimately maybe going to affect your bottom line, but maybe they were just scoping the place out.
Yep.
And, one leads to 2 candy bars, 3 candy bars. And, next time it's the front door keys. And, then you find yourself in a much more serious situation. And I do wonder if storytelling has always been a fascinating component of any job for me. And I wonder if people who are listening might pick that one up and use it to tell stories to their CEO and board going forward.
The other interesting dynamic, respectfully, about our profession is our error rates are inordinately high. If you think about it, we have spent a ton of money on security, a ton of money on staffing and tooling and things of that nature, and yet our environments continue to be breached. So as a profession and as an industry, including kind of the manufacturers and suppliers of security technology, we don't have the most laudable track record that we can point to. And part of that, I think, is that we're very devoid, even though we have lots of standards and frameworks, from looking at this as a functional business service. If you and I were both CFOs or controllers, we wouldn't debate assets, we wouldn't debate liabilities, income and expenses and disclosures. We would follow generally accepted accounting principles. But if we go up and we have a discussion on what is reasonable security for our organization, it's an inordinately wide debate about what's reasonable for application security, what's reasonable for database security, or containers and Kubernetes, or our networks and our storage and our backup environments. And so as a profession, I think it's important for us to occasionally take pause and look at other areas within the enterprise and think about that. If we had the level of issues in finance and accounting, companies would be materially restating their income. They would be, constantly making updates and disclosures to the market. Kind of the financial crisis that we had necessitated Sarbanes-Oxley. So we've got kind of that interesting dynamic that we face right now as a profession. I think realistically, we need to be more risk focused. We need to be much more quantitative in how we look at our security programs. And we need to have kind of a degree of transparency with what that quantitative risk consideration is to the executive leadership team and the board of directors. One last thing, and then I'll jump off my high horse here for just a moment. But there's considerations afoot within these proposed rules by the Securities and Exchange Commission that the board of directors for public companies ideally has somebody akin to a qualified financial expert on the technology side, a qualified technology expert, or minimally disclose to the market whether or not the board has certain kind of requisite technological or security capabilities within that team. In other words, can they truly exercise their fiduciary responsibility absent somebody that understands, technology in the industry and those things. And so I think, again, we see this confluence of issues that are driving our security programs to be more business aligned, more business focused. But we have a lot of retooling that we're going to have to do as we think about our security programs moving forward.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was what CISOs can do to harden themselves and their organizations from kind of getting into one of these situations in the first place. I know one of the first interactions we had was on the topic of cyber incident tabletop exercises.
Yep.
Where do they come in? What kind of role do they play? And do you feel like they're effective tools to kind of make sure this type of event doesn't happen at your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think first and foremost, any CISO worth his or her salt, as it were, needs to take a look at the incident response plan, validate it, review it, have workshops with key stakeholders throughout the organization, workshops to review organizational priorities, who's effectively authorized to disclose things like a data breach, who can communicate with law enforcement or is authorized to bring in law enforcement, who can communicate with the media, et cetera. So when you look at your incident response program and its plan, as I noted in the CISO desk reference guide, one term I use is declare war on ambiguity. That's where you declare war on ambiguity. You don't want any ambiguity at all about who is authorized to take certain steps and actions, what organizational priorities there are, who are the members of the team, how to get a hold of them, third-party resources and vendors, things of that nature. So I think the incident response program should remain a front and center item on every security program and every CISO's agenda. The tabletop exercises are an interesting thing. They can be formalized with third parties. There's companies that do that. My company does that as an example, where we'll come in and steward or facilitate a tabletop exercise. But they can also be done very informally. And I think they're not mutually exclusive. Let's say you and I had a large team. I'm a member of your team, and you meet me at the water cooler and you go, Matt, what would happen if we had a rogue domain admin in our environment? How would you respond? And you walk away. I'm already framed on that discussion. I'm starting to think about, old approaches, Red Forest and all that, but how do I harden my domain? How do I keep track for service accounts and elevated privilege accounts and what entitlements they have and when they were created, when they were last used? All that type of stuff kind of comes into it. I strongly, strongly believe that just having those discussions, having incident response and various scenarios to ransomware, DDoS, phishing, lost or stolen device, compromised credentials, a compromised third-party vendor that provides really critical services to the company. Having the broader security team and those organizational stakeholders aware of these risk scenarios is foundational. Be it through tabletops, be it through a lunch and learn workshop, whatever it might be, or even just an off the cuff comment at the water cooler. All of those things get the organization to be more prepared for what is, I think, in many cases, almost an eventuality. Every company is going to have security incidents. Our goal as CISOs is to make our organization as resilient as possible and to minimize the impacts of those. And that requires a lot of diligence and training.
Yeah, and I think the folks within cybersecurity teams are really good at having those conversations naturally, right? Like and not to mention, like, we're always, I think, stereotypically like super pessimistic about everything, right? Like, oh, this is definitely going to break sometime, or we kind of rightfully, in a sense, have this mentality of it's, don't cast a stone at that company because you could be next, kind of thing, right? Because all it takes is one vulnerability, and you're the next one. But yeah, so we're really good at having these kind of like water cooler moments. We could talk about the bad stuff that's happening, and really it's like casual threat modeling. But I think what I've learned too is that you'll find the people in legal, the people in privacy, the people even in finance, and in every other domain of a company, they find this stuff pretty interesting. I mean, like, it is very interesting to think about what you would do. I mean, if you think about it, a privacy person might be in their privacy world thinking about, fraud events all day, and something, that we don't necessarily have to deal with all the time. Legal, dealing with just kind of menial complaints or big lawsuits, whatever it may be. But you kind of come in with a fresh breath air potentially and say, well, what would happen if this really crazy, kind of thing that maybe they don't really fully understand, but it really stimulates this kind of intellectual discussion about stuff. I really like that that idea of like kind of pushing to have those conversations outside of security more?
It must be. I mean, I think there's absolute value with our respective teams getting into kind of the technical nuance. Forensics by design. Do I have access to logs and telemetry data to address or understand what's occurring? If I don't have it internally, do I have a good identified third-party firm that can come in and kind of complement and support those actions? But we don't do security for security's sake alone. We do security to support and underpin the organization. And so, to your point, which is absolutely correct, you need folks from HR, you need folks from operations, you need members of the executive leadership team, up to and including occasionally the board of directors. And that's always a kind of a loaded environment to do these exercises. But these other stakeholders, one, I think they find this stuff intrinsically fascinating if it's done well. But they also need to be aware that what they thought was an important level of risk that maybe have been controlled isn't as controlled as they thought it actually was. And I'll give a real world example. I kind of butchered the way I described that. Too frequently, our business continuity and disaster recovery plans have things like a recovery point or a recovery time objective or some kind of maximum tolerable downtime measurement. Generally speaking, those are looking at environmental considerations. We had to relocate a data center, or we lost a network, or we had to move from facility A to facility B, or, we've got certain levels of redundancy and fault tolerance brought in. And you might have a really critical system measured in, say, 2 hours of RPO and 2 hours of RTO, and maybe it's a day in terms of its maximum tolerable downtime. If you and I have root in that environment, you're not getting us out in 2 hours. You're not getting us out in 8 hours. So there's a degree of vulnerability. There's a degree of risk there that our traditional BCDR plans don't necessarily contemplate with cyber issues. And the reality is that we're more likely to get hit with a cyber issue than a hurricane, an earthquake, a tornado, wildfire, some other form of issue. And so I think as a consequence, it's all about resilience, in my view, is how do we make the organization more resilient? Part of that resilience is built upon foundationally ensuring that all the stakeholders have a common set of facts. Here's kind of what we can do. Here's what we can't do. Here's what we're able to see. Here's what we don't see from a risk perspective. How do you and other members of the executive leadership team want to deal with these dynamics? And it's a dialogue versus the sky is falling and all the negative things. It's more of a risk-based discussion when it's handled correctly.
Yeah, I've seen this a few times, just in my career, just through talking to people, and sometimes I see and hear this reluctance to air dirty laundry, in cyber incident response tabletops, and I guess even in the elevating of certain risks, right? Because sometimes the reality is a risk could exist because, the cybersecurity team hasn't matured enough to cover a certain aspect or control. I don't know if there's really, the golden answer here, but do you have any words of advice for people who struggle with, this kind of proverbial airing of the dirty laundry for the greater good, really?
I go back to the point I made at the beginning of the discussion is no one really wants to be blindsided. And if we were to look, for example, like in the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, they talk about in section, I think 502, about reasonably anticipated threats. What are those reasonably anticipated risks to my organization? Recognizing that part of that risk calculus can be, I accept that risk. I have a very limited amount of resources. I've got some really critical strategy and initiatives that the organization is focused in on. We're going to accept this risk. Here's another set of risk, and we're going to try to mitigate that as best as we can, or we'll transfer or insure against it as best as we can, kind of traditional risk management. I think the one form of risk management that is never tolerable is to ignore or hide risk. When you do that, ultimately that will come up and bite somebody in the posterior. So my guidance is look for ways to quantify risk. I think key risk indicators, KRIs, are horribly underused in our industry. Ideally, you tie them into like a standard or a framework. You categorize them in three kind of classes, those that are coverage X of Y type KRIs, those that are removing risk, operational risk reduction type KRIs, and personnel risk. I've got 10,000 hours worth of work and I've assigned it to 2 people. Okay, clearly I've got a staffing issue.
I feel like everyone's going to think that sounds familiar, but yeah.
Exactly. The risk treatment related to all of that is ultimately a corporate decision. So if you're my boss, the last thing I want to do is effectively hide information from you that you need to be able to affect key areas of your function or your responsibility. And so my view is you want to make sure that risk status is moving up and down the organization appropriately. It goes back to that high level point that we have to kind of translate and distill technical risk into enterprise risk related to the business and its strategy. There's an art form in doing that. Equally important, I think it's critical for most of us CISOs, is getting out of the proverbial behind the desk and talking to other stakeholders in the business. My friend and co-author, Gary Hayslip, back when he was the CISO for the city of San Diego, did a proverbial walkabout. He'd go meet with the library folks. He'd go meet with Parks and Recreation, the PD, all different kind of functional areas within the city. Every time he did, he was discovering new things that warranted attention to effectively make sure that the city council, the city manager, and the mayor were not blindsided by risk, again, that could have been reasonably anticipated. So I think so much of our job is really predicated on understanding the nature and sources of risk, trying to capture things in things like risk registers, so that we have a proverbial inbox to document these risks, and then being there as a resource for our friends and colleagues across the extended C-suite to help them think through what the implications are. So my view is, again, I tend to err on the side of transparency and trust versus obfuscation, and I'll leave it at that.
I think that's probably a good thing. So, I've noticed that a pretty overarching theme seems to be really laying that groundwork so these decisions aren't that difficult, right? It's just like anything in life. If you wait till the last second, it just becomes a harder decision. If you're building the foundations of trust with, both the people you report to, the board of directors, and the people that work for you, and the teams that work adjacent to you, these kind of conversations come more naturally and become easier over time. Yep. I want to pivot. I have 2 more questions here. One of the details I found very interesting, pivoting back to the Joe Sullivan case a little bit, that I found very interesting was they tried to frame this as a bug bounty payout, right? And one of the key findings that they found in the case was that in the, they called it a gag order that they had these hackers sign as part of the, quote unquote bug bounty program, they mentioned that they weren't allowed to blog about this. They weren't allowed to basically tell anyone that they hacked Uber. But investigators found, this didn't take a rocket scientist to do. They just looked at their FAQs on their bug bounty program, and it just said, you can blog about this. Great, you found a bug, you could talk about it. And so this was a very fundamental, legal, easy kind of check mark, I think, for prosecutors and just people looking. And it really highlighted to me, now, of course, removing myself from the situation in and of itself, it really highlighted for me the importance of consistency in legal processes when it comes to cybersecurity. And I wonder if you had any insights or thoughts about that.
It's one of those adages is your general counsel should be your best friend. that there should be a lot of time, whether it's having coffee, lunch, whatever it might be, with the GC, be it fractional, full-time, whatever the case may be. You want to make sure that you're having open discussions around disclosure and risk and things of that nature. And it's a broader set of individuals, kind of going back to an underlying set of themes in these great questions. If you're my boss, I might ask, how would you like for me to communicate risk to you? Should that be an informal discussion? Should that be in a memo? Should that be in a formalized third-party assessment? Do you want that on a risk register? What are some of the approaches, mechanisms, et cetera, for me to communicate that to you? So the CISO, he or she, is effectively trying to adapt to whatever kind of the corporate style and the specific style of those key individuals around how they want to be informed of that. If the individual comes back and says, you know what, don't ever tell me about any risk, well, I might start getting the resume polished a little bit and seeing what else is out there. If he or she is saying, you know what I want to do is systematically look at this stuff on a risk register, we're going to go through and we'll prioritize it with other types of enterprise risk, and we'll make informed decisions up to and including accepted risk. Well, I know that I've got a partner now within the C-suite that will allow me to bring material issues to his or her attention for their treatment. And fundamentally, I think as CISOs, that's the best that we can hope for. We want to be able to disclose the fact pattern, have a number of recommendations related to it, always kind of aligned to business strategy and initiatives and as appropriately constrained by corporate resources, but to make sure that we're kind of conveying that to an organization. And I think you've got organizations that take risk management seriously, including cyber risk and all that entails. And then you've got other organizations where they really don't want to be informed of what's happening. But these are the organizations that get flattened by the marketplace, hit by regulators, named in large amounts of litigation and other types of lawsuits. And it goes back to the basic premise of what type of organization is this? Is this one that values trust and transparency? Transparency does not come. It is not exclusive of like need to know and least privilege and things of that nature. Transparency means those individuals that are duly authorized to understand that fact pattern are informed. Doesn't mean that there's an obligation to inform a larger audience. There may be, there may not be. So I want to just clarify that point. Transparency and need to know and least privilege are not mutually exclusive. It's a nuanced topic. But I think realistically, going back to it, and I apologize about the rambling here, effectively, a CISO wants to be in an organization that values that values an open, collaborative discussion on risk. You might, as my boss, go, listen, I agree, this is a really, really challenging problem, and there's some important risk here. However, I've got 20 other types of risks that right now are higher priority for the organization. Let's come back to this in 6 months. Fine. That is an absolutely perfect response by a CEO. Now, it could be, I think the priority of that risk should be higher, and I'll do, what I can in my role to make sure that, an advocacy for that risk treatment is there. But ultimately, the risk treatment belongs to the CEO, the C-suite, and by extension, the board of directors and their oversight and fiduciary responsibility.
Yeah, great. I want to be respectful of your time, Matt. I did have one more question here, and then I'll let you kind of close it with whatever message you wanted to tell the audience here. But one of the key themes for me when I was kind of thinking of the Joe Sullivan case, I can't help but come back to empathy and just looking at the scenario at hand and not casting too hard of a judgment, or at least, reserving the harshest of judgment on the character, themselves in this scenario. And, one of the things that I couldn't help but reflect on was, you've got someone who's been extremely successful, and oftentimes we hear of leaders and people who have moved up throughout their career, especially in like rapid paces, they change over time. And I think some even say like, well, I didn't think I would make that decision. If you would have asked me 20 years ago, would I have done the same, done this thing in this scenario? I think there's a lot of people in positions of power who say, I didn't think I would do something like that, maybe. Right. And so I kind of reserve that judgment, and same type of empathy-based analysis for Joe Sullivan. I wonder if you had any kind of parting thoughts on people who are kind of like coming up through the ranks. Their ambition is to be a CISO. I don't know if there's, we talked a lot about a lot of these things already, but is there anything that, like, from a character perspective or like a personal, self-building kind of foundation building of your character perspective that you think is foundational for someone who's developing into a CISO?
Yeah, I think your point on empathy is really important. By extension, empathy is also an element of curiosity. I'm curious what the other person thinks about this issue, how they look at it, things of that nature. I had a buddy of mine that I went to graduate school with, and he goes, if you always tell the truth, you don't need a good memory. So I think that's a great adage. The last thing that I would say is fundamentally, and we're probably preaching to the respective choirs here, CISOs live in glass houses. There is so much that we are expected to control, so much that we are expected to harden and secure. And we have infinite risk in many ways that we're up against. And so I think one of the things that I always try to do is to avoid judging another CISO in what he or she is doing within their security environment, because we don't know. They may be doing phenomenal work with the fraction of the resources that you and I have been allocated. Or they may have had to come in and clean up after a previous administration or a previous set of individuals didn't focus in on certain things. So we don't really know what the dynamics were that led to that security program at that point. What I will say, though, without any shadow of a doubt, is tone at the top is really important. Character counts, context counts. And I think to your point, which is perfect, empathy is absolutely critical. And I think one of the things that you see, and this podcast is a perfect example of us, is CISOs are almost in a default mode looking to collaborate and communicate with other CISOs just to share best practices, because none of us has a monopoly on everything that we should be doing or not doing or how we should look at these issues. We're only getting better as we collaborate more, as we share best practices, and frankly, as we highlight some of our, bloody knuckled scenarios where we've made mistakes and hopefully learn from them. So I love your point about empathy. I could not agree more.
Yeah, great addition there, Matt. Thank you. Well, hey, man, it's been amazing. Thank you for joining the podcast. And I wanted to leave these last minute or two or however long you need just to kind of give yourself a plug and tell people where they can find you.
Absolutely. You can always find me on LinkedIn or any place where Hawaiian shirts are sold. I will be close by. I just want to thank you. Again, going back to this notion of collaboration at RSA, they talked about stronger together. And I think that's a good way to look at that. And we face a lot of challenges, and we shouldn't be beating each other up or beating ourselves up too seriously in this industry. So I think the ability to kind of break bread, share stories, meet and collaborate with other security leaders is always just as advisable as can be. So would welcome the opportunity to talk with anybody if they want to look me up on LinkedIn, or any feedback or comments on any of the books. Would love that as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Matt, and thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you next time.
Take care.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the podcast on your favorite podcasting platform or visiting www.infosecsidekick.com/podcast.